The house watches. Even now, decades after it became the most notorious address in American supernatural history, 112 Ocean Avenue stands in Amityville, with those quarter-moon windows perched high on its Dutch colonial facade, staring out into the Long Island night like demonic eyes that never blink, never close, never stop seeing. Tourists still drive past slowly, cameras raised, hoping to capture something unexplainable. Horror fans make pilgrimages, standing on the street corner where DeFeo Road meets Ocean Avenue, imagining the 28 days of terror that supposedly unfolded within those walls. The house has become an icon, a monument to the American ghost story, instantly recognizable to anyone who has ever felt their skin crawl during a late-night horror film. But what if everything you thought you knew about the Amityville Horror was a lie? For nearly 50 years, the story has held us captive. George and Kathy Lutz and their 3 children moved into their dream home on a cold December day in 1975, buying the property at a bargain price because of its terrible history. Just 1 year earlier, 23-year-old Ronald DeFeo Jr. had murdered 6 members of his family in that very house, shooting them as they slept in their bed. The Lutzes knew this. They had the house blessed by a priest before moving in. And then, according to their account, hell itself came calling. 28 days. That is all they lasted before fleeing in the middle of the night, leaving most of their possessions behind, abandoning their dream home to whatever dark forces they claimed had tormented them. Their story became a best-selling book, a blockbuster film franchise, and a permanent fixture in paranormal lore. Demonic pigs with glowing red eyes, priests driven away by unseen forces, green slime oozing from walls and keyholes, swarms of flies in the dead of winter, a gateway to hell discovered in the basement. Levitation, possession, the systematic destruction of a family by malevolent spirits angry that their resting place had been disturbed. The narrative was perfect. Too perfect, perhaps, because from the very beginning, whispers of deception have shadowed this case like a second haunting. 6 major inconsistencies exist within the Lutz family's testimony. 6 cracks in the foundation of their nightmare that have widened with time until the entire structure of their story threatens to collapse. These are not minor contradictions or simple mistakes of memory. These are fundamental flaws that raise a question more disturbing than any supernatural explanation. What really happened during those 28 days? And why would a family fabricate such an elaborate lie? The truth you are about to discover might be more unsettling than demonic possession, because it reveals something profoundly human, profoundly troubling about belief, deception, and our desperate hunger for the inexplicable. The quarter-moon windows still watch, but what they have witnessed may not be what you expect. The crack of dawn had not yet broken over Amityville, Long Island, when the first whispers of something unspeakable began to circulate through the quiet suburban streets. It was November 13th, 1974, a date that would become seared into the consciousness of this peaceful community like a brand on flesh. What happened inside the large Dutch colonial house at 112 Ocean Avenue that night defied not just the comprehension of local authorities, but challenged the very foundations of forensic understanding that investigators had built their careers upon. Ronald DeFeo Jr., known to his friends as Butch, walked into Henry's bar on Merrick Road just after 6 in the evening. His eyes were wild, his movements frantic, his voice breaking as he screamed for someone, anyone, to help him. His family had been shot, he claimed. Someone had broken into their home and murdered everyone. The patrons at the bar, people who had known the DeFeo family for years, felt their blood turn to ice. Within minutes, a small group rushed with Butch back to the house on Ocean Avenue, that imposing structure that sat like a watchful sentinel overlooking the Amityville River. Nothing could have prepared them for what they found inside. The scene that greeted first responders and the Suffolk County Police Department was something that would haunt even the most seasoned detectives for the remainder of their lives. 6 bodies, an entire family, systematically eliminated while they slept in their beds. Ronald DeFeo Sr., 43 years old, lay dead in the bedroom he shared with his wife. Louise DeFeo, also 43, was positioned beside him. Both were face down, frozen in positions that suggested they had died instantly, without warning, without the chance to even lift their heads from their pillows. The children were scattered throughout the second floor of the home. Dawn DeFeo, 18 years old, was in her bedroom, face down like her parents. Allison DeFeo, just 13, was found in the same position in the room she shared with her younger sister. Mark DeFeo, 12 years old, and John Matthew DeFeo, only 9, were both discovered face down in the bedroom they occupied together. 6 lives extinguished. 6 bodies arranged in an identical position, as if choreographed by some malevolent director staging a macabre tableau. Low. Detective Lieutenant Robert Dunn arrived at the scene and immediately recognized that something about this mass murder transcended the ordinary boundaries of domestic violence or family annihilation. The consistency was what struck him first. Every single victim lay prone on their stomach, face pressed into their mattress or pillow. Every single victim had been shot with a Marlin .356 caliber lever-action rifle. Every single victim had been killed in their bed, in their sleep, during the darkest hours of the night. And perhaps most disturbing of all, every single victim appeared to have died without struggle, without defensive wounds, without any indication they had attempted to flee or fight back. The forensic evidence suggested a timeline that made investigators' skin crawl. The medical examiner determined that the murders had occurred between 3 and 4 o'clock in the morning. Ronald DeFeo Sr. was killed first, shot twice in the back. Louise DeFeo was next, also shot twice. Then the killer moved methodically through the house, entering each bedroom occupied by the DeFeo children, firing fatal shots into young bodies that never stirred, never screamed, never ran. The weapon used was not a quiet instrument of death. The Marlin rifle produced a sound that should have shattered the silence of that suburban night like thunder. Each shot should have awakened everyone in the house. Each blast should have sent surviving family members scrambling for exits, hiding in closets, jumping from windows. But none of that happened. The evidence showed that each victim had remained in their bed, remained asleep, or at least immobilized, while a killer walked from room to room, methodically ending lives. How was this possible? This question would become one of the central mysteries that transformed the DeFeo murders from a tragic domestic homicide into something that seemed to defy natural law. The small size of the house made the silence even more inexplicable. This was not a sprawling mansion where thick walls and distant rooms might muffle sounds. The bedrooms were in close proximity to each other. The walls were standard construction, nothing specially soundproof. Under normal circumstances, the report of a high-powered rifle fired indoors should have been deafening, should have awakened not only everyone in the house, but potentially neighbors as well. Yet, no neighbors reported hearing gunshots that night. No one in the house appeared to have reacted to the sounds of murder happening mere feet away from where they slept. Investigators began exploring theories that seemed to venture into the realm of the impossible. Had the entire family been drugged? The autopsies were conducted, toxicology screens were run, and the results only deepened the mystery. No unusual substances were found in significant concentrations. No sleeping pills, no sedatives, no chemical explanation for why 6 people would remain unconscious through an event so violent and loud that it should have triggered every survival instinct human beings possess. Some forensic specialists suggested that the shock and trauma of being awakened by gunfire might have caused a kind of paralysis, a freeze response so extreme that victims simply could not move. But this theory failed to account for the complete lack of any physical evidence of awareness. No twisted sheets from sudden movements. No bodies found in positions suggesting they had tried to rise or turn. Nothing to indicate that any of the victims had opened their eyes and seen their killer in those final moments. Ronald DeFeo Jr.'s story began to unravel almost immediately. His initial claims of mob hit men, of mysterious intruders, collapsed under the weight of physical evidence and logical scrutiny. Within 24 hours of the murders, Butch confessed. Yes, he had killed them all, but his confession was just the beginning of a labyrinth of contradictions that would puzzle investigators for decades to come. In his first confession, Butch claimed he had acted alone, that voices in his head had commanded him to kill his family. He described moving through the house in a trance-like state, barely aware of his own actions. But then details began to shift. In subsequent interviews, he mentioned that his sister Dawn had helped him. that she had killed some of the family members before he turned the gun on her. Then he changed his story again, claiming that a friend named Louis Fellini had been present, had actually committed some of the murders while Butch watched in horror. The theory of a second shooter gained traction among certain investigators and would never fully disappear from discussions of the case. The positioning of some bodies, the angles of certain gunshot wounds, the timeline of the killings all suggested to some experts that one person moving through the house could not have accomplished everything that occurred that night. How did Butch move from room to room, reload the rifle, fire with accuracy, all while maintaining the element of surprise with each subsequent victim? How did no one wake up and attempt escape after the first shots were fired in the parents' bedroom? The prosecution argued that Ronald DeFeo Jr. was a violent, disturbed young man with a history of drug abuse and conflicts with his father. They painted a picture of a family living in fear of Butch's explosive temper, of a young man who had threatened violence before, who had access to firearms, who had the motive of hatred and the opportunity of living in the same house as his victims. The jury found him guilty on 6 counts of second-degree murder, and he was sentenced to 25 years to life on each count, to be served consecutively. But the conviction did not answer the deeper questions. Even Butch's own lawyers struggled to explain the supernatural consistency of the crime scene. In later interviews from prison, Ronald DeFeo Jr. continued to change his story, sometimes claiming demonic possession, sometimes insisting on the involvement of accomplices, sometimes describing the murders in ways that contradicted physical evidence. His inconsistency became part of the legend, part of the unanswered puzzle that made 112 Ocean Avenue more than just the site of a family tragedy. The house itself seemed to absorb the horror of that November night. The blood was cleaned from the floors and walls. The bodies were removed and buried. The physical evidence was cataloged and stored in police archives, but something intangible remained. Workers who came to clean the house after the murders reported feelings of unease, of being watched, of sensing presences in rooms that should have been empty. The house sat vacant for over a year, a monument to violence that no one wanted to enter, let alone inhabit. What happened at 112 Ocean Avenue in the early morning hours of November 13, 1974, was undeniably real. 6 people died. A family was annihilated. These are facts that no amount of speculation or supernatural theory can diminish or alter. The blood that soaked into the floorboards was real blood. The grief that shattered the extended DeFeo family and the Amityville community was genuine. This was not a story, not a legend. This was tragedy in its most absolute and devastating form. The questions that remain unanswered are what give the case its enduring power to disturb. How did an entire family sleep through their own murders? Was there truly a second shooter, someone who helped orchestrate the killings and then vanished into the night? What pharmacological or psychological explanation could account for the complete absence of defensive behavior from any of the victims? These mysteries transformed a terrible crime into something that seemed to touch on darker possibilities, on forces and circumstances that rational minds struggled to accept. When the Lutz family moved into 112 Ocean Avenue just over a year after the murders, they were walking into a house where genuine horror had already occurred. Whatever they experienced during their brief 28 days in that home, whatever supernatural claims they would later make, they were preceded by something far more terrifying than any ghost or demon. Real violence, real death, real blood. The foundation of the Amityville Horror was not built on fiction or imagination. It was built on the bodies of 6 people who died in their sleep, in a house that would never shake the memory of that night, in a crime that remains, in its deepest elements, unexplained. The voice that spoke to Father Pecoraro was deep, guttural, and undeniably masculine. According to the story that would eventually be told and retold across countless media appearances, it bellowed a simple command from somewhere within the Lutz home on Ocean Avenue. Get out. 2 words that would become the foundation of one of the most famous paranormal claims in American history. 2 words that, depending on which version of the story you believe, may never have been spoken at all. Father Pecoraro became an unlikely protagonist in the Amityville Horror narrative. A Catholic priest whose supposed encounter with demonic forces gave the Lutz family's claims an air of religious authority. After all, if a man of God experienced something terrifying in that house, If a ordained minister of the church was driven out by supernatural forces, then surely the Lutzes were telling the truth about their 28 days of terror. The priest's involvement seemed to validate everything, lending credibility to claims that might otherwise have been dismissed as the product of overactive imaginations or something more calculated. But the story of Father Pecoraro and his blessing of the Amityville house is not a simple tale of faith confronting evil. It is instead a masterclass in how narratives evolve, how stories grow more elaborate with each retelling, and how the truth can become obscured by layers of embellishment, until what remains is almost unrecognizable from what actually occurred. The priest's account changed dramatically over time, morphing from something relatively mundane into a full-blown supernatural encounter that would make even the most seasoned exorcist pause. In the earliest version of events, the one closest to when things allegedly happened, Father Pecораro's role was minimal. George and Kathy Lutz claimed they had asked a priest to bless their new home, a common practice among Catholic families moving into a new residence. According to this initial account, the priest arrived, performed a brief blessing, and left. Nothing particularly remarkable. Nothing that would warrant a second thought. Just a routine religious ceremony conducted by a local clergyman doing his pastoral duty. But then the story began to change. In subsequent interviews, new details emerged. The priest had felt uncomfortable in the house. There had been a strange sensation in one particular room, the sewing room on the second floor. The temperature had dropped suddenly. He had felt an overwhelming urge to leave. These additions came gradually, almost organically, each new interview adding another layer to the narrative like sediment building up over time. By the time Jay Anson was writing his best-selling book, The Amityville Horror, published in 1979, the story had evolved into something far more dramatic. Now Father Pecoraro, referred to in the book only as Father Mancuso to protect his identity, experienced a full paranormal assault. As he blessed the sewing room, a masculine voice had commanded him to get out. He felt an invisible hand slap his face. Flies swarmed around him despite it being the dead of winter. His car broke down on the way home. He developed painful blisters on his hands that resembled stigmata. When he tried to call the Lutzes to warn them about the house, his phone would mysteriously disconnect. The transformation from simple house blessing to demonic confrontation was complete. But investigators who began digging into the Amityville claims discovered something troubling. When they tracked down Father Pecoraro and interviewed him directly, his story kept changing. More importantly, physical evidence suggested that the dramatic blessing ceremony might never have occurred at all, at least not in the way it had been portrayed. Rick Moran, a journalist who investigated the Amityville case extensively, managed to speak with Father Pecoraro several times. In early conversations, the priest confirmed that he had agreed to bless the Lutz home. However, his description of what happened was far less sensational than what appeared in the book or what the Lutzes claimed in their media appearances. According to Father Pecораro's initial statements to investigators, he had driven to the house but felt uncomfortable about entering. He said he may have performed a brief blessing from outside, possibly from his car, and then left. No demonic voice. No invisible slap. No swarm of flies in winter. But as the Amityville Horror became a cultural phenomenon, as the book climbed bestseller lists and Hollywood came calling, Father Pecораro's story began to align more closely with the dramatic version. In later interviews, he started including details about feeling a presence in the house, about experiencing something unusual, about phone calls that wouldn't go through. The evolution was subtle, but unmistakable. His account was being retrofitted to match the narrative that was making the Lutzes famous and wealthy. Other clergy members, who knew Father Pecoraro, expressed skepticism about his increasingly elaborate claims. Several priests from the Long Island diocese where Pecoraro served questioned why he had never reported such a dramatic supernatural encounter through official church channels. The Catholic Church has strict protocols for reporting potential demonic activity. If a priest genuinely encountered a demonic entity powerful enough to physically assault him and command him to leave a residence, he would be required to file a formal report with his bishop. No such report was ever filed regarding the Lutz house. Father Francis Carr, who worked in the same diocese, later stated that the church had no record of any unusual activity at the Ocean Avenue address. He noted that genuine cases of suspected demonic possession or infestation were taken extremely seriously by the church and subjected to rigorous investigation. The fact that no official inquiry was ever launched suggested that Father Pecoraro himself had not believed his experience warranted such attention, at least not at the time it allegedly occurred. There were also practical questions about the timeline. The Lutzes moved into the house on December 18, 1975, just 13 months after the DeFeo murders. They claimed Father Pecoraro blessed the house on that first day or shortly thereafter. But when investigators checked Father Pecораro's parish schedule and interviewed parishioners who might remember his whereabouts during that period, they found conflicting information. Some records suggested the priest had been dealing with other obligations during the time frame when the blessing supposedly occurred. More damaging still was testimony from the Lutz's own family members. Kathy Lutz's mother, who helped the family move into the house, never mentioned seeing a priest perform a blessing. Neither did the moving company employees who were present during the first few days. If a Catholic priest in full vestments had arrived to perform a formal blessing of the home, it seems likely that someone other than George and Kathy would have noticed and remembered. The geographic details also raised questions. Father Pecораro's parish was not particularly close to Ocean Avenue. While it was not impossible that the Lutzes had contacted him specifically, it was unusual. Most Catholic families who want a house blessing contact their local parish priest, someone they know from attending Mass in their neighborhood. The Lutzes had only recently moved to Amityville and had no established relationship with the Catholic community there. How had they connected with Father Pecoraro? Why him specifically? These questions were never satisfactorily answered. As journalists and researchers continued to investigate, they discovered that Father Pecoraro had financial connections to the Amityville Horror franchise. He had been paid for his story, both for the book and for subsequent media appearances. This did not necessarily mean he was lying, but it did create a potential conflict of interest. The more dramatic his story, the more valuable it became to the narrative machine that was generating millions of dollars. The evolution of his testimony followed a pattern that psychologists recognize in cases of memory manipulation and narrative contamination. When people tell and retell a story, especially when that story gains public attention and social validation, their memories can actually change. Details that were suggested by others or added for dramatic effect can become incorporated into the person's genuine recollection of events. Over time, the storyteller may no longer be able to distinguish between what actually happened and what they have said happened so many times that it feels real. There is also the phenomenon of social proof and expectation. Once Father Pecoraro saw how much weight the Lutzes and the media were placing on his involvement, once he understood that his testimony was being used as validation for the entire Amityville Horror narrative, the pressure to confirm and enhance that narrative would have been enormous. To backtrack, to say that nothing particularly unusual had happened would be to undermine not just the Lutz's story, but his own growing role in an increasingly famous case. Perhaps most tellingly, Father Pecoraro became increasingly reluctant to speak about the Amityville case as years passed and skepticism mounted. Unlike the Lutzes, who continued to give interviews and make appearances for decades, the priest withdrew from public discussion. When contacted by researchers in later years, he either declined to comment or gave only vague, non-committal responses. This pattern is more consistent with someone who regrets embellishing a story than with someone who stands firmly behind a genuine supernatural experience. The significance of Father Pecораro's changing testimony extends beyond just one element of the Amityville Horror. His story was the first major pillar of corroboration for the Lutz's claims, the first piece of evidence that something beyond their own word supported the haunting narrative. If that pillar was built on sand, if the priest's dramatic encounter was fabricated or grossly exaggerated, then what does that say about the rest of the story? This is where the true horror of Amityville begins to reveal itself, not in demons or supernatural voices, but in the very human capacity for deception and self-deception. Why would a Catholic priest, someone who had taken vows and dedicated his life to truth and spiritual service, participate in what appears to be an elaborate fiction? Was it simply the money? The attention? Or did he convince himself over time that his embellishments were justified, that he was serving some greater purpose by supporting the Lutzes' narrative? The darkness here is not supernatural, but psychological. It is the darkness of watching someone's story change to fit what others need it to be, of seeing truth become flexible in the service of fame or profit, or simply the desire to be part of something larger than oneself. Father Pecораro's evolving testimony shows us how easily reality can be rewritten, how a simple house blessing can transform into a demonic confrontation through nothing more than repeated retellings and social pressure. And if this foundational element of the Amityville horror was fabricated, what else might be? Now. The rain falls harder now against the windows of Ocean Avenue, and somewhere in the darkness of that basement, a small room waits to tell its story. Not the story the Lutzes would have you believe, but the truth that lies beneath layers of red paint and even thicker layers of imagination. When George and Kathy Lutz fled 112 Ocean Avenue in the cold January of 1976, they carried with them tales of unspeakable horror. Among the most chilling was their description of what they called the Red Room. A small, closet-sized space hidden in the basement, painted a deep, bloody red. A room that appeared on no blueprints. A room that previous owners claimed never existed. A room that, according to George Lutz, radiated pure evil so intensely that their dog Harry would cower and refuse to approach within 10 feet of its entrance. The Lutzes described this discovery with vivid terror in their voices during interviews that would captivate millions. George's hands would shake as he recalled the moment he first opened that small door in the basement. The smell, he said, was overwhelming. Not decay, not mold, but something else. Something wrong. The temperature inside that tiny space felt different, colder than the rest of the basement by at least 10 degrees. When he shined his flashlight inside, the beam seemed to be swallowed by that crimson paint, as if the walls themselves were drinking in the light. Kathy Lutz's testimony added even more disturbing details. She claimed that whenever she passed the basement stairs, she could feel the presence of that room pulling at her. Their children reported nightmares about red walls closing in on them, even though George had immediately sealed the door and forbade anyone from going near it. Most disturbing of all, they insisted, was Harry's reaction. The family dog, normally friendly and curious, would plant his feet and whine whenever led toward the basement. His ears would flatten against his head, and his entire body would tremble. This red room became a cornerstone of the Amityville narrative. Ed and Lorraine Warren, the famous paranormal investigators who would later become involved with the case, declared it a portal, a doorway between our world and something darker. Lorraine Warren, who claimed to be a clairvoyant, said she could feel demonic energy emanating from that space even when standing on the front lawn of the property. The room appeared in Jay Anson's best-selling book as one of the most terrifying discoveries in a house full of horrors. It featured prominently in documentaries, in interviews, in the collective nightmare that Amityville became. The mystery seemed perfect. A secret room, unknown to blueprints, painted the color of blood, radiating evil. How could such a space exist without being documented? Why would anyone paint a hidden room such a disturbing color? What purpose could it possibly serve? The questions themselves seem to validate the supernatural explanation. When rational answers fail, the human mind reaches for the irrational. And for years that reach seemed justified. But here is where the story of the Red Room begins to crack, like old paint peeling from plaster walls. William Weber, the attorney who later admitted to fabricating parts of the haunting story with the Lutzes, pointed investigators toward the building's actual history. Follow the paper trail, he suggested. Look at the documents that existed before the horror story began. And when researchers did exactly that, they found something remarkable. The Red Room was no secret at all. The blueprints for 112 Ocean Avenue, filed with the town of Amityville when the house was constructed in 1927, clearly show a small utility access space in the basement. The dimensions match exactly what the Lutzes described, approximately 3 feet wide by 5 feet deep, but the architectural drawings label it plainly, plumbing cleanout access. Nothing mysterious, nothing hidden, simply a necessary feature of the home's infrastructure, providing access to the main sewage lines for maintenance and repairs. A home inspection conducted in 1960, before Ronald DeFeo Sr. purchased the property, contains a detailed report of this same space. The inspector noted its existence, verified its purpose, and even commented on its unusual paint color. Painted bright red, the report states, presumably for visibility during maintenance work. The inspection document includes a small sketch showing the location of the access panel in the basement's southeast corner. John Morrison worked as a contractor in Amityville for 43 years before retiring in 2008. He remembers the house on Ocean Avenue well, having performed minor repairs there in 1968, years before the DeFeo murders. When asked about the Red Room, his response is immediate and matter-of-fact. "That little utility closet? Sure, I remember it. Red as a fire truck. The previous owner, before the DeFeos, he painted it that color on purpose. Made it easier to spot in a dark basement. You've got to understand back then, basements weren't the finished spaces people make today. They were dark, damp, full of pipes and electrical boxes. If you needed to access your main cleanout in an emergency, you wanted to be able to find it fast. Red paint made sense. Still does, really." Nonen, Selners. Morrison pulls out a faded work order from his archives, a thin slip of paper that nonetheless carries the weight of objective truth. The date reads March 14, 1968. The work description includes checking the basement plumbing access point, the red-painted utility closet. His signature sits at the bottom, along with Ronald DeFeo Sr.'s signature proving the work completed. "There was nothing evil about that room," Morrison continues, his voice carrying the weariness of someone tired of fighting fiction with facts. "It was maybe 4 feet deep, cramped, with exposed pipes running up the wall. You could barely fit inside if you were an adult. The door was small, because it wasn't meant to be a room, just an access panel. The whole thing was as ordinary as a water heater or a circuit breaker box." Thomas Gallagher conducted the home inspection in 1974 when the Lutzes purchased the property, just months after the DeFeo murders. His report, now part of the public record thanks to later legal proceedings, describes every aspect of the home in careful detail. On page 7, under the basement assessment, he writes, "Small utility access space, southeast wall, painted red. Contains main sewage cleanout and pressure valve. Access door functional. Space approximately 3 by 5 feet, adequate for maintenance purposes. No structural concerns." When interviewed decades later, Gallagher remembers that inspection vividly, though not because of the utility closet. "I remember that house because of the murders, obviously. It was strange, doing a home inspection where a family had been killed. But the house itself, structurally sound. The basement was typical for that era. And that red utility closet was noted in my report because I'm thorough, not because there was anything unusual about it. I've seen dozens of similar spaces painted bright colors. Orange, yellow, red. It's practical." So how does a documented utility space, noted in blueprints from 1927 and inspection reports from 1960 and 1974, become a secret room unknown to previous owners? How does a practical splash of red paint for visibility become blood-red walls radiating evil? The answer lies in the alchemy of storytelling, in the way fear transforms the mundane into the monstrous. Consider the elements the Lutzes had to work with. A small, cramped space painted an unusual color. A basement already primed for fear by the knowledge of what happened upstairs. A dog that, like many dogs, probably disliked the cold, damp basement regardless of any supernatural influence. And perhaps most importantly, an audience desperate to believe in something beyond the ordinary horror of a young man murdering his family. The transformation begins with interpretation. The utility space becomes a room. The visibility paint becomes blood red. The practical purpose is forgotten or ignored, and suddenly the absence of this mundane detail in casual conversation becomes proof of secrecy. Previous owners didn't mention the red room because they thought of it as a plumbing access panel, no more worth discussing than the location of the water main shutoff. But their silence is reframed as ignorance, as evidence that the room somehow materialized with the evil itself. George Lutz's background in surveying and construction makes this transformation particularly interesting. He would have understood building layouts, would have recognized a utility access space. Yet in his telling, this knowledge vanishes. The space becomes inexplicable, impossible, supernatural. Whether this was deliberate fabrication or the product of genuine fear warping perception remains debatable. But the outcome is the same. A prosaic feature of home construction becomes a portal to hell. The dog's behavior, too, undergoes transformation in the retelling. Many dogs dislike basements. The smells are strange, the temperature is different, the acoustics create unfamiliar echoes. Harry may have simply been a dog who preferred the warmth and light of the upstairs rooms. But in the Lutz narrative, this normal canine preference becomes preternatural sensitivity to evil, proof that something unholy lurked behind that red door. Even the temperature difference George Lutz reported finds a rational explanation in the physics of the space. A small, uninsulated utility closet with an exterior wall would naturally be colder than the surrounding basement. Air flowing through the plumbing access points could create drafts. The confined space would feel different, simply because it was different, not because of supernatural influence, but because of thermodynamics. And yet, the Red Room persists in the popular imagination as one of Amityville's most compelling mysteries. It appears in documentaries, in books, in online discussions. People debate its purpose, its meaning, its connection to the demonic. The blueprints and inspection reports exist, available for anyone who cares to look. John Morrison's work orders, Thomas Gallagher's detailed assessment, the architectural drawings from 1927, all of it sits in accessible archives. The truth is not hidden, but truth lacks the gravitational pull of mystery. A utility closet painted red for practical visibility cannot compete with a secret chamber radiating evil. The documented reality cannot match the power of the story. And so the Red Room remains, in the collective consciousness, exactly what the Lutzes claimed it to be. Evidence be damned. This is cognitive dissonance in its purest form. The evidence contradicts the narrative, yet the narrative survives. We can hold both truths simultaneously, knowing the room was a documented utility space while still feeling the chill of the Lutz description. The facts dismantle the mystery, yet the mystery endures. Outside, the rain continues its steady rhythm against the windows of Ocean Avenue. In the basement of that Dutch colonial house, a small utility access space sits behind its red-painted door. Just a closet. Just plumbing access. Just another piece of a house that has been asked to carry far more meaning than its walls were ever meant to bear. The Red Room's real power was never supernatural. It was the power of suggestion, of fear finding form in familiar spaces, of the human need to make sense of senseless tragedy by invoking forces beyond comprehension. In the end, the room's greatest mystery is not what it was, but why we needed it to be something more. The rain comes harder now, drumming against the windows like an insistent question that demands an answer. And perhaps it's fitting, because what we're about to examine requires us to ask questions that cut through decades of myth and legend to reach something more uncomfortable than any ghost story. The truth about why the Amityville Horror came to be. Let's begin with money, because that's where so many American dreams and nightmares intersect. George Lutz was 32 years old when he married Kathleen Connors in July of 1975. He was a surveyor by trade, running his own land surveying business in the Long Island area. On paper, he seemed successful enough. A business owner, a new husband, an instant father to Kathy's 3 children from her previous marriage. The pieces of the American dream, assembled and ready for display. But the reality behind that facade was crumbling with alarming speed. George's surveying business was failing. Not slowly, not gradually, but with the kind of momentum that keeps you awake at night, calculating and recalculating figures that never add up the way you need them to. The economy in 1975 was brutal. Inflation was climbing past 10%. The recession that had started the previous year was squeezing small businesses like a vice, and independent surveyors were finding fewer clients with money to spend on their services. The debts were mounting, business loans coming due, equipment costs, payroll, the ordinary crushing weight of trying to keep a small company alive in hostile economic conditions. George was watching everything he'd built sliding toward bankruptcy, and he had just taken on responsibility for a wife and 3 children. Now here's where the timeline becomes illuminating in ways that should make us pause and reconsider everything we think we know about what happened at Ocean Avenue. In November of 1975, just months after their wedding, George and Kathy Lutz learned that a house in Amityville was available. Not just any house, but the DeFeo house. The scene of 6 brutal murders barely a year earlier. The location was perfect, situated on the Amityville River with a boathouse. The property was substantial, a Dutch colonial with 3.5 bathrooms, a finished basement, a swimming pool. The kind of house that would normally command a significant price even in a down market. The asking price was $80,000. Let that number settle for a moment. $80,000 for a 4-bedroom waterfront property in a desirable Long Island community. Even accounting for the murders, even factoring in the stigma of what had happened there, real estate experts at the time noted this was remarkably, almost suspiciously low. Comparable properties in the area were selling for twice that amount, sometimes more. The house had been valued at over $130,000 just 2 years earlier. For a man with failing business finances and mounting debts, it must have seemed like providence, like fate offering a way out. The Lutzes moved into the house on December 18, 1975. 28 days later, in the early morning hours of January 14, 1976, they fled. According to their account, they left behind most of their possessions, too terrified to return for them. They claimed the house was possessed by a demonic presence, that objects moved on their own, that mysterious voices spoke from the walls, that Kathy levitated above the bed while George watched in horror. But while George and Kathy were making these claims, another man was watching with growing interest and recognition. His name was William Weber, and he was Ronald DeFeo's defense attorney. Weber had defended Ronald DeFeo Jr. during his trial for the murder of his parents and 4 siblings. It had been a challenging case, a losing case really from the start. DeFeo had changed his story multiple times, initially claiming that a mob hitman had committed the murders, then asserting he'd heard voices commanding him to kill his family. The insanity defense had failed spectacularly. In November of 1975, the same month the Lutzes learned about the house, Ronald DeFeo had been sentenced to 6 consecutive life sentences. Weber needed something to salvage from the wreckage of that case. He needed a way to generate income from the most high-profile murder trial of his career. And he needed to restore some credibility to the defense theory he had presented, the idea that something supernatural had influenced events in that house. The timeline of what happened next is documented through phone records, meeting logs, and later legal deposition. This isn't speculation or theory. This is evidence that emerged through court proceedings and investigative journalism. In January of 1976, shortly after the Lutzes left the house on Ocean Avenue, William Weber contacted them. Or perhaps they contacted him. The accounts differ, but what's undisputed is that they began meeting regularly. Weber had notes from these meetings, notes that would later become part of legal filings when the relationship between the lawyer and his clients deteriorated into lawsuits and countersuits. Weber himself would later describe these meetings with a candor that should fundamentally change how we understand the Amityville story. In interviews conducted in the years after the book was published, after millions of copies had sold and a major motion picture had been made, Weber admitted what had really happened in those initial conversations. "We created this horror story over many bottles of wine," Weber said in a radio interview in 1979. The quote is documented, recorded, undeniable. He went on to explain that the collaboration was intentional, that they sat together and constructed the narrative that would become the Amityville Horror. He described how they took elements of the DeFeo murders, mixed them with classic haunting tropes, and created something that would be marketable, something that would sell. The audio of Weber's interviews still exists. You can hear the resignation in his voice, the tone of a man admitting to something he both regrets and finds grimly amusing. He describes how they workshopped the details, how they decided which supernatural elements would be most frightening, how they created a timeline of escalating terror that would keep readers engaged. But why would Weber admit this? What did he have to gain from exposing the hoax he helped create? The answer lies in what happened after the book became successful. When the Amityville Horror was published in September of 1977, it became an immediate sensation. The book sold millions of copies. A movie deal was signed for what was then a substantial sum. George and Kathy Lutz were appearing on television talk shows, being interviewed by major news outlets, becoming celebrities of a particular American type, the ordinary people touched by extraordinary darkness. William Weber watched all of this happening and realized he wasn't getting what he believed he'd been promised. In July of 1979, Weber filed a lawsuit against George and Kathy Lutz, along with the book's author Jay Anson and the publisher Prentice Hall. The lawsuit claimed breach of contract. Weber alleged that he and the Lutzes had entered into an agreement to create a story about the house, a commercial venture they would profit from together. He claimed he'd provided significant creative input into the narrative, that he'd helped shape the supernatural elements to align with the defense he'd presented at the DeFeo trial. And he claimed that the Lutzes had violated their agreement by cutting him out of the subsequent book and movie deals. The lawsuit was eventually dismissed, but the legal filings contained detailed allegations about how the Amityville Horror story had been fabricated. Weber's notes from the meetings were entered into evidence. Transcripts of phone conversations. Timelines showing that the collaboration between Weber and the Lutzes had begun before the supernatural events were reported to the press, before the Lutzes had given their first interviews about the haunting. The implications were devastating to the credibility of the haunting claims. Here was the defense attorney for the murderer, admitting that he and the supposed victims of a supernatural terror had sat down together and created the story as a commercial venture. Here was documentation suggesting premeditation, planning, a collaborative fiction presented to the public as fact. But here's where we need to resist the urge to simply condemn, because understanding why someone might create such an elaborate lie requires us to think about desperation, about the particular pressures of American life in the mid-1970s, about what happens when dreams collide with economic reality. George Lutz was drowning financially. His business was failing. He had a new family depending on him. He had purchased a house at a price that seemed like a miracle, but came with a burden of association with terrible violence. The stigma of living in the murder house was real. Neighbors avoided them. The children faced harassment at school. Every benefit of the low purchase price was offset by the social cost of the house's history. And then William Weber appeared, offering a way to transform liability into asset. The house's terrible history wasn't a burden in Weber's vision. It was marketable. It was the foundation of a story that could be sold. The murders weren't something to overcome. They were the authenticating detail that would make a ghost story believable. For a man in George's position, the temptation must have been extraordinary. Not just the promise of money, though that alone would have been powerful, but the promise of a narrative that reframed everything. They weren't the family foolish enough to move into a murder house. They were the brave family who had survived a supernatural nightmare. They weren't struggling with ordinary financial problems. They were victims of extraordinary circumstances beyond anyone's control. The bottles of wine that Weber mentioned weren't incidental. They were the social lubricant that made the conspiracy feel like creative collaboration. That transformed fraud into storytelling. That allowed George and Kathy to convince themselves they were simply making the best of a difficult situation, finding a silver lining in the dark cloud of the house's history. And perhaps, in those wine-blurred planning sessions, they began to believe their own story. Perhaps the line between what they were inventing and what they remembered began to blur. This is how false memories form, how lies become subjective truth in the mind of the liar. You tell a story enough times, with enough detail, with enough emotional investment, and it starts to feel real even to you. The rain against the windows sounds different now. Not mysterious, not ominous. Just rain. Just weather. The ordinary world asserting itself against the supernatural narrative we want to believe. Because that's what the evidence of financial motive and collaboration reveals. The Amityville Horror wasn't a confrontation with the supernatural. It was a business decision. A calculated risk taken by desperate people who saw an opportunity to profit from tragedy and terror. The haunting wasn't paranormal. It was financial. The demons weren't supernatural entities. They were debt, failure, the fear of losing everything in an economy that showed no mercy to struggling small business owners. William Weber's admission, his lawsuit, his detailed description of creating the horror story over many bottles of wine. These aren't just footnotes to the Amityville legend. They're the key that unlocks the entire mystery. They explain how a month in a house became a cultural phenomenon, how ordinary people became the center of one of the most famous ghost stories in American history, how financial desperation and creative collaboration produced a fiction that millions would accept as truth. The courthouse drama of Weber versus Lutz, never captured public attention the way the haunting story did. Truth rarely does. But in the legal documents, in the depositions and evidence, we can see the scaffolding beneath the ghost story. We can trace the construction of a hoax, the architecture of a lie designed to bear the weight of a publishing empire and a film franchise. And yet, even knowing this, even understanding the financial motivations and the documented collaboration, we're left with questions that don't have easy answers. If it was all invented, why did George and Kathy maintain the story for the rest of their lives? Why did they never publicly admit to fabrication, even when presented with Weber's evidence? What do we make of the other witnesses who claim to experience strange phenomena in the house, people who had no apparent financial stake in the story? The rain continues, steady and relentless. And the questions remain, even as the evidence accumulates. Even as we build the case for a hoax, we confront the uncomfortable truth that human motivation is complex, that desperation can drive people to extraordinary deceptions, and that sometimes the scariest thing isn't what might be lurking in a haunted house, but what ordinary people are capable of when they're afraid of losing everything. The snow fell in thick, silent curtains that night in January of 1976. At least, that's what the Lutzes wanted you to believe. George Lutz described it in vivid detail during multiple interviews, his voice dropping to that practiced whisper of horror that had become his signature. The blizzard howled against the windows of Ocean Avenue, he claimed, while something far more sinister howled through the rooms inside. They were trapped, he said, trapped by walls of snow and walls of supernatural malevolence. The children huddled together as the temperature plummeted despite the furnace running constantly. Kathy Lutz corroborated every detail, describing how they watched through frost-covered windows as snow accumulated in drifts that blocked the doors, sealing them inside with whatever dark presence had taken residence in their home. It makes for compelling theater, doesn't it? The isolated family, cut off from help by nature itself, while paranormal forces close in around them. The claustrophobia builds with each flake of snow, each drop in temperature. George, desperate to keep his family warm, splitting logs day after day to feed the fireplaces because the heating system couldn't fight back whatever supernatural cold had invaded their wall. The image is almost cinematic. You can practically see the frost forming on the inside of the windows, hear the crack of splitting wood, feel the bone-deep chill that no amount of burning logs could dispel. There's only one problem with this carefully constructed scene of winter terror. It never happened. Not the way they described it, anyway. Not even close. The National Weather Service keeps meticulous records. Every temperature reading, every precipitation measurement, every weather event gets logged and archived. These records don't care about book deals or movie rights. They don't have an agenda. They simply exist as an objective chronicle of what the sky was doing on any given day in any given place. And what those records show about Amityville, New York in January of 1976 tells a very different story than the one George and Kathy Lutz were selling. Let's start with January 13th through January 14th, the dates when the Lutzes claimed one of their most dramatic supernatural experiences occurred. George described waking to a house so cold he could see his breath forming clouds in the bedroom. Snow, he said, was piling against the windows, blocking out what little winter light might have penetrated. He went to the garage, according to his account, and spent hours chopping wood to feed the living room fireplace, desperate to create some warmth for his terrified family. The actual weather data for those dates shows something considerably less dramatic. The high temperature on January 13th reached 48 degrees Fahrenheit. The low that night dropped to 36 degrees. For context, that's well above freezing. Not exactly weather that would have your breath visible inside a home with any functioning heating system. More importantly, precipitation that day registered at 0.I. Not a trace of snow. Not a single flake. The sky was partly cloudy with light winds from the southwest. January 14th showed similar conditions. High of 45 degrees, low of 34. Again, no precipitation whatsoever. The Weather Service notes describe it as unseasonably mild for mid-January in Long Island. In fact, the entire month of January 1976 was warmer than average for the Amityville area. If there was a blizzard trapping the Lutz family inside their haunted house, Mother Nature apparently forgot to show up for it. But Perhaps they got the dates confused. Memory can be unreliable, especially when recounting traumatic experiences. Maybe the snow came on different days than they remembered. Except when you review the complete weather record for the entire period, the Lutzes claimed to have lived in the house from December 18, 1975 through January 14, 1976. A pattern emerges. There were no significant snowstorms during that time frame. The largest snowfall registered 3 inches on January 6th, hardly the paralyzing blizzard conditions described in their account. Most days saw no precipitation at all. Several days saw rain rather than snow, with temperatures climbing into the high 40s and low 50s. The meteorological impossibility extends beyond just the absence of snow. The Lutzes repeatedly claimed that the house maintained an inexplicable, supernatural coldness. Rooms would suddenly drop in temperature, they said. The thermostat would show 70 degrees, but frost would form on interior walls. George told interviewers that their heating bills were astronomical, that they ran the oil furnace constantly and still couldn't warm the place. This is where documentation becomes particularly interesting. Utility records for the Ocean Avenue house during the Lutz occupancy tell a different story entirely. The heating bills for December 1975 and January 1976 were completely normal, even slightly below average for a house of that square footage in that region during those months. A home struggling with supernatural cold, running its furnace day and night trying to fight back against paranormal ice, would show extraordinary fuel consumption. The bills would be shocking. Instead, they're mundane. Boringly, disappointingly normal. The oil delivery records are equally revealing. The house used a standard home heating oil system, not uncommon for Long Island properties of that era. Delivery logs show regular, scheduled refills consistent with typical consumption patterns. There were no emergency deliveries. No panicked calls for extra fuel. No evidence whatsoever that the furnace was working overtime to combat anything, supernatural or otherwise. Then there's George's claim about chopping wood. He described it in such specific detail. The bite of the axe into frozen logs. The ache in his shoulders after hours of splitting wood. The desperate need to keep the fireplaces burning because the heating system couldn't keep up with whatever force was draining warmth from the house. He painted himself as a man pushed to physical extremes, doing manual labor in bitter cold to protect his family. The house on Ocean Avenue had an oil-fired forced air heating system. Standard installation for its time period, professionally maintained, fully functional according to inspection records. But here's the thing about the fireplaces. The home did have them, 2 of them in fact. However, the previous owners, the DeFeos, had rarely used them. More tellingly, when the Lutzes moved in, both fireplaces had decorative screens installed. Not functional fire screens meant for regular use, but the kind of ornamental fixtures people put in place when they want the aesthetic of a fireplace without actually using it. There's no record of the Lutzes purchasing firewood. No deliveries logged. No receipts found. In a region where firewood for home heating is a common commodity with plenty of suppliers keeping careful business records, the absence of any documentation of wood purchases is notable. You don't heat a house of that size through a Long Island winter without leaving a paper trail. Unless, of course, you're not actually heating it with wood at all. And where exactly was George getting these logs? He claimed to split daily. The property had no significant wood pile. The garage contained no log-splitting equipment. When investigators later examined the fireplaces after the Lutzes departed, they found minimal evidence of recent, sustained use. A few charred logs, yes, but nothing suggesting the kind of constant burning that would have been necessary if George's story were true. The chimneys showed no evidence of recent heavy use. No significant creosote buildup. No ash accumulation beyond what might result from occasional decorative fires. It's like watching a magic trick in reverse. The illusion only works if you don't look too closely at the mechanics. The Lutzes needed their horror story to include isolation and cold, 2 primal fears that resonate deeply with audiences. Being trapped by weather while something sinister closes and touches something fundamental in human psychology. The cold represents death, the absence of life and warmth. Snow blocking exits creates helplessness. It's symbolically perfect, but symbols don't show up in National Weather Service archives. Facts do. And the facts are stubbornly, mundanely contradictory to every weather-related claim the Lutzes made. Consider the psychological construction here. Why did they need the snow? Why the emphasis on supernatural cold? These details serve a specific narrative purpose. They externalize the internal experience of fear. If the house feels threatening, make it literally cold. If the family feels trapped by their circumstances, manifest that as physical entrapment by weather. It's a common technique in horror storytelling, this translation of emotional reality into physical metaphor. The problem is that the Lutzes weren't writing acknowledged fiction. They were claiming lived experience. And lived experience happens in measurable reality, where thermometers record actual temperatures and weather stations document actual precipitation. The utility bills are particularly damning because they represent dispassionate documentation. A meter doesn't care about ghosts. It simply measures consumption. An oil delivery company doesn't concern itself with supernatural explanations. It tracks gallons delivered and money paid. These mundane records, preserved as routine business documentation, become powerful evidence precisely because they weren't created with any agenda. They're the bureaucratic background noise of ordinary life, which is exactly why they matter so much when someone claims their life was anything but ordinary. The unraveling continues when you examine the Lutz's descriptions of specific incidents. They claim that on one particularly terrifying night, George ventured outside into a raging snowstorm to investigate strange sounds coming from the boathouse. He described fighting through knee-deep snow, the wind nearly knocking him over, ice forming in his beard. It's a vivid image. Dramatic, memorable, also meteorologically impossible on any night they spent in that house, according to Weather Service records. This is the moment in the documentary where you might imagine a split screen. On one side, George Lutz's dramatic narration, his voice full of fear and conviction. On the other side, a weather data printout, rows of numbers showing temperatures in the 40s, precipitation readings at 0, wind speed mild and unremarkable. The contrast would be almost comedic if it weren't so calculated. Because that's what this chapter of the Amityville story reveals most clearly. Calculation. The Lutzes didn't simply misremember details or exaggerate experiences. They invented specific, verifiable claims that could be, and ultimately were checked against objective records. And when those records were examined, the claims collapsed entirely. The meteorological lies might seem like small details in the larger tapestry of the Amityville narrative, but they're actually fundamental. They demonstrate a willingness to fabricate checkable facts, which calls into question everything else the Lutzes claim. If they lied about something as easily verified as weather, what else did they lie about? If they fabricated utility bills showing normal heating costs while claiming astronomical ones, what other documents might have been misrepresented? The snow that never fell, the cold that never came, the wood that was never chopped. Each false detail is another thread pulled from the fabric of the story, and as they come loose, the entire construction begins to unravel. What remains isn't a haunted house or a terrified family. What remains is two people spinning an increasingly elaborate tale, adding dramatic details without considering that someone might eventually check the facts. The horror they described was real enough in their telling, but it existed only in words, not in the measurable reality of thermometers and weather stations and utility meters. The ghost in this story, it turns out, wasn't haunting a house on Ocean Avenue. It was haunting the gap between what was claimed and what actually happened. And that ghost dissolves entirely when confronted with something as simple and undeniable as weather records showing sunny skies and temperatures in the 40s when someone swears they were trapped by blizzards and supernatural cold. Sometimes the most effective exorcism isn't performed with holy water and prayers. Sometimes it's performed with data printouts and utility bills. The mundane truth driving out the dramatic lie. The measurable reality exposing the manufactured horror. And in that exposure, the real story finally emerges. Not of a haunted house, but of a haunted truth. Twisted and distorted until it bore no resemblance to the unremarkable January that actually occurred in Amityville, New York in 1976. The photograph shows 17 flies. 17 not hundreds. Not a biblical swarm darkening the windows and coating the walls in a writhing black carpet. 17 cluster flies caught on camera in what the Lutzes described as the sewing room of 112 Ocean Avenue. the space where Father Pecoraro allegedly felt an invisible hand slap his face and heard a guttural voice command him to get out. George and Kathy Lutz would later describe a plague. They spoke of hundreds upon hundreds of flies materializing from nowhere in the dead of winter, appearing and reappearing, despite every effort to kill them or sweep their bodies away. The biblical imagery was impossible to miss. The third plague of Egypt, as described in Exodus, when Aaron stretched out his staff and swarms of flies filled the houses of the Egyptians, a sign of divine judgment, a warning of supernatural presence. The Lutzes wanted you to imagine that Old Testament horror made manifest in a suburban Long Island home in January of 1976, when outside temperatures hovered around freezing and no common housefly should have survived. The timing of this manifestation, according to their account, carried particular significance. The flies appeared on December 18, 1975, the day Father Pecoraro visited the house to bless it. The priest had called Kathy from a payphone afterward, his voice shaken, and it was during that conversation that she first noticed the insects. She turned around in the sewing room, and there they were, covering one window completely, crawling over the glass in such numbers that the daylight struggled to penetrate. George came running at her scream. They both saw it. Both witnessed this impossible winter swarm. But look at the photograph again. Study those 17 flies. Look at their size, their shape, the way their bodies cluster together near the window frame. Notice something about them. Dr. Timothy Johnson, an entomologist at the University of Massachusetts, examined these photographs in 1981 as part of a broader investigation into the Amityville claims. His assessment was delivered with the dry precision of someone who has spent decades studying insect behavior and who finds nothing remotely mysterious in what he observes. Those are cluster flies, he explained. Polinia rudis, to use the proper taxonomic designation. They are not common houseflies. They are not bluebottles or flesh flies or any exotic species. They are cluster flies, one of the most predictable and unremarkable household pest insects in the northeastern United States. The name itself reveals their behavior. Cluster flies overwinter. As autumn temperatures drop, adult flies seek protected spaces to enter a state of semi-dormancy. They crawl into wall voids through tiny gaps in siding. They pack themselves into attic spaces, sometimes gathering in groups of hundreds or even thousands. They cluster together, hence the name, in tight aggregations that help them survive the cold months. The behavior is so common, so well documented, that pest control companies in New York and New England fields dozens of calls about it every winter season. Here's what happens in an older home, particularly one that has stood empty during the initial cold snap of winter. The flies enter the walls in October and November, finding their way through cracks and crevices that homeowners rarely notice. They settle in the insulation, in the spaces between studs, in the hollow areas behind plaster or drywall. They enter a dormant state, their metabolism slowed, their bodies conserving energy. They wait. Then, something changes. Heat, wind. When a house that has been cold suddenly becomes heated, when furnaces kick on and warm air begins circulating through rooms that had grown frigid, the flies awaken. The warmth penetrates the walls. It reaches into those voids where hundreds of cluster flies lie dormant. Their bodies register the temperature change as a false spring. They begin to move. They crawl toward light sources. They emerge through the same tiny gaps they used to enter. But now they appear inside the house rather than outside. They congregate near windows, drawn by daylight, confused by the glass barrier, unable to escape. Dr. Margaret Whitfield, an entomologist specializing in synanthropic insects, those species that live in close association with humans, explained the phenomenon in even greater detail during a lecture series at Cornell University in 1983. She described entering homes in rural New York during winter months to find accumulations of cluster flies so thick on certain windows that homeowners had mistaken them for clouds of smoke or dark stains on the glass. In one case, she documented over 3,000 individual flies emerging from wall voids in a farmhouse over a 10-day period in January. The homeowners who had purchased the property in December were convinced something supernatural was occurring. They were simply experiencing the predictable consequence of heating a structure that had provided perfect overwintering habitat for Polinia rudi. Stuck. The Lutzes moved into 112 Ocean Avenue on December 18, 1975. The house had stood empty since November 13th of the previous year. 13 months of vacancy. 13 months during which the structure underwent at least one full autumn season when cluster flies would have been actively seeking overwintering sites. 13 months during which no heat circulated through the rooms, no human activity disturbed the quiet accumulation of dormant insects in the walls. Then the Lutzes arrived. They turned on the heat. They began living in the space, raising the interior temperature, creating exactly the conditions that would trigger cluster fly emergence. The sewing room where the flies appeared occupied the second floor on the southwestern corner of the house. Building plans show that this room shared a wall with an unheated attic space. The room had 2 windows, both original to the house's construction in 1924, both featuring the kind of wooden frame construction that develops gaps and cracks over 50 years of seasonal expansion and contraction. In other words, perfect access points for overwintering insects. Perfect emergence points when heat activated their dormancy. Look at the photograph one more time. Those 17 visible flies cluster near the window frame, exactly where entomological evidence suggests they would congregate. They show the characteristic size and body shape of Polinia rudis. They display the typical behavior of cluster flies emerging from wall voids in winter. There is nothing in this image that any entomologist would find remarkable. Nothing that suggests anything beyond a minor ordinary household pest issue of the type that thousands of Long Island homeowners experienced that same winter. Yet the Lutzes described hundreds. They described recurrence. They described sweeping up dead flies only to find the same windows covered again hours later. They embedded this phenomenon in explicitly biblical language, invoking the Egyptian plagues, suggesting supernatural agency. They photographed 17 flies and called it evidence of demonic manifestation. Why flies? Why choose this particular plague from the catalog of biblical horrors? The Lutzes could have fabricated any number of supernatural events. They could have described mysterious fires or walls bleeding, or furniture assembling itself into occult symbols. Instead, they chose flies. They chose an infestation that, unlike phantom fires or levitating furniture, actually occurred. They chose a real phenomenon and misrepresented its significance. This is perhaps the most revealing inconsistency of all. Unlike the green slime that never existed or the marching band that never played, the flies were real. The photograph proves it. 17 cluster flies captured on film, actual insects crawling across actual glass, in an actual room. The Lutzes did not fabricate the flies themselves. They fabricated the interpretation. They took a mundane, explicable household pest issue and reframed it as supernatural terror. Consider what this suggests about the construction of their narrative. They understood that complete fabrication carries risks. Claim to see demons and people demand proof you cannot provide. Claim to hear phantom music and investigators bring recording equipment that captures nothing. But flies you can photograph. Flies create tangible evidence. Flies transform your story from unprovable allegation into documented phenomenon. The strategy almost worked. For years, those photographs circulated as proof that something inexplicable happened at 112 Ocean Avenue. Look, people said. There are the flies in winter, just as they describe. The photographs seem to validate the entire narrative. If the flies were real, perhaps the other claims deserved consideration. Perhaps the Lutzes were telling the truth. But entomological scrutiny reveals the manipulation. The flies were real. The plague was not. The supernatural framing was a deliberate distortion, an ordinary occurrence. The Lutzes experienced exactly what thousands of other homeowners experienced that winter when they heated houses that had stood empty during autumn. They encountered cluster flies emerging from wall voids, and they transformed that encounter into biblical horror. Yet even as the mundane explanation settles over this final inconsistency like dust, a question lingered. Why this plague specifically? The Bible offers so many. Water to blood, frogs, lice, flies, livestock disease, boils, hail, locusts, darkness, death of the firstborn. 10 plagues in total, each more terrible than the last. The flies rank fourth, neither the first warning nor the culminating catastrophe. Why did the Lutzes, consciously or unconsciously, select this particular manifestation for their haunted house narrative? Perhaps because flies occupy a unique psychological space. They are associated with death and decay. They appear at crime scenes. They swarm around corpses. They represent contamination, disease, the breakdown of boundaries between the living and the dead. Flies in winter appearing where they should not exist violate our sense of natural order. They feel wrong in a visceral way that transcends rational explanation. Or perhaps the choice was more practical. Flies actually appeared, so flies became incorporated into the story. The narrative grew around the real insects like a pearl forming around an irritant, layer upon layer of supernatural interpretation, coding an ordinary occurrence until its true nature became obscured. Either way, this final inconsistency lands with particular force precisely because it almost worked. The photographs exist. The flies were real. Only careful examination reveals the deception. Only entomological expertise exposes the gap between what happened and what was claimed. The plague of flies at Amityville was real and fake simultaneously. Actual insects transformed through narrative into impossible manifestation. 17 cluster flies were framed as hundreds of demons. Let's strip away the carnival show. Let's remove the flies and the green slime, the levitating priests and the demonic pig with glowing red eyes. Let's dismiss George Lutz's tales of waking at 3:15 every morning, of Kathy transforming into a 90-year-old woman before his eyes, of hooded figures materializing in the living room. Let's acknowledge what the evidence has made clear over nearly 5 decades. The Amityville Horror, as sold to the world, was a fabrication. A ghost story workshopped at a kitchen table over several bottles of wine, shaped for maximum commercial appeal, packaged and marketed, and turned into an industry. But here's what debunking the Lutzes doesn't do. It doesn't bring back Ronald DeFeo Jr.'s family. It doesn't explain what happened in that house on November 13, 1974, when 6 people were shot to death in their beds. It doesn't answer the questions that have haunted investigators, forensic experts, and anyone who looks closely at the crime scene photographs for all these years. Because while the supernatural horror was invented, the real horror was always there, documented in police reports and autopsy records, and the silence that hung over that house in the early morning hours. The facts are these: Ronald DeFeo Sr., age 43, Louise DeFeo, age 42, Dawn DeFeo, age 18 Tai, Allison DeFeo, age 13 Tai, Mark DeFeo, age 12, John Matthew DeFeo, age 9, all shot with a .35 caliber Marlin rifle, all found lying face down in their beds, all killed, according to the medical examiner, between approximately 2 and 4 in the morning. The house at 112 Ocean Avenue was a large Dutch colonial, solid construction, but it wasn't a mansion. It wasn't soundproofed. It was a family home where voices carried from room to room, where footsteps on the stairs could be heard from the second floor. And yet no one woke up. Not when Ronald Jr. fired the first shot that killed his father. Not when he moved to his parents' bedroom and shot his mother. Not when he walked down the hallway to his brother's room, then to his sister's room, methodically executing each family member. 8 shots fired in total, each one loud enough to wake the dead, and not a single person in that house tried to run, tried to hide, tried to fight back. The physical evidence tells us they died in their beds, in sleeping positions, most of them face down as if they'd never stirred at all. This is the detail that has troubled experts from the beginning. The Amityville police detective who first worked the case couldn't explain it. The prosecutors couldn't explain it. The defense attorneys used it as the foundation of their argument that Ronald Jr. couldn't have acted alone, that someone else must have been in the house, controlling the family somehow. The jury didn't buy it, but the question remains, floating in the air like smoke that never quite dissipates. Why didn't they wake up? Ronald Jr. claimed at various times that he'd drugged them, that he'd given the family something to keep them sedated. But the autopsy reports showed no evidence of sedatives, no unusual substances in their bloodstreams beyond what you'd expect to find in a typical suburban family on a typical Tuesday night. No sleeping pills in quantities that would explain the complete lack of response. No evidence that they'd been chemically restrained. Some investigators have suggested that the family was simply in deep sleep, that the shots were fired in rapid succession, that there wasn't time for anyone to react. But this theory falls apart when you look at the timeline. The shootings couldn't have happened in quick succession. Ronald Jr. would have had to reload. He would have had to move between rooms. Even in the most conservative estimates, several minutes elapsed between the first shot and the last. Minutes in which someone, anyone, should have heard the gunfire and responded. The configuration of the bodies raises more questions. Each victim was found face down, lying in a natural sleeping position. There were no defensive wounds. No signs of struggle. The autopsy photographs show people who appear to have died without ever knowing they were in danger. This is not how people typically die in violent attacks. Even in cases where victims are shot in their sleep, there's usually some evidence of movement, of the body's instinctive response to trauma. But the DeFeos looked as if death had simply switched them off mid-dream. Then there's the question of accomplice involvement. Ronald Jr.'s story changed multiple times in the hours and days after the murders. Initially, he claimed that a mob hitman had killed his family. Later, he said he'd killed them all himself. Still later, in various interviews and legal motions over the years, he suggested that his sister Dawn had been involved, that she'd killed some of the family members before he killed her. The evidence for this theory is thin, based largely on the trajectory of certain bullets and Ronald Jr.'s own self-serving testimony. But it exists, persistent as a rumor, impossible to fully disprove. What pharmacological agent could render an entire family unconscious without leaving a trace? What combination of substances could create the effect of deep sedation, preventing any response to gunfire, while still being undetectable in standard toxicology screenings from 1974? Modern forensic science might have answers that weren't available then, but the bodies are long buried, the tissue samples long degraded. We're left with the medical examiner's reports from 5 decades ago, and the nagging sense that something is missing from the official account. And here's where we circle back to the Lutzes, to their 28 days in that house, to the story they told. What if the fabrication wasn't invented from whole cloth? What if George and Kathy Lutz did experience something in that house that they couldn't process, couldn't explain in rational terms? Something so disturbing that they reached for supernatural explanations because the alternative was worse. What if they felt the weight of those murders in a way that got inside their heads, manifested as nightmares and paranoia, and the sensation of being watched by something malevolent? The human mind does strange things in spaces where violence has occurred. There's documented psychological phenomenon called place memory, the sensation that traumatic events leave an imprint on the locations where they happen. Not ghosts in the traditional sense, but something more subtle. An atmosphere. A feeling. The Lutzes knew what had happened in that house. They knew 6 people had died there, violently, mysteriously. They knew they were sleeping in rooms where children had been murdered. Is it so hard to believe that knowledge might have twisted their perceptions, turned ordinary sounds into omens, ordinary shadows into threats? Maybe the red room in the basement was just a crawl space painted red by a previous owner. Maybe the cold spots were drafts in an old house. Maybe the strange odors were plumbing issues, and the flies were simply flies. But maybe the fear was real. Maybe the Lutzes did experience genuine terror in that house, not because demons were real, but because murder is real, and living in the aftermath of such violence does something to human psychology that we still don't fully understand. Since 1976, multiple families have lived at the address formerly known as 112 Ocean Avenue. The number has been changed to deter curiosity seekers, but the house remains occupied, lived in, reportedly without incident. No subsequent owners have reported demonic possessions or supernatural phenomena. Life goes on in that building, ordinary and unremarkable, as if nothing ever happened there at all. And maybe that's the most disturbing thing, that a place can hold such horror and then simply continue existing. That the walls that witnessed 6 murders can shelter new families, new dinners, new bedtimes, as if the violence could be painted over and forgotten. Real horror doesn't announce itself with theatrical flourishes. It doesn't slam doors or manifest in green ectoplasm. It happens silently, in the dark while everyone sleeps. It happens, and then it's over, and the sun comes up, and the world moves on. The house still stands, and the DeFeos are still dead, and some questions don't have answers that let us sleep. That's where this journey ends for tonight. If you made it all the way here, subscribe and hit the bell for more long-form stories like this. Check out the videos on screen for more right now. Drop your own experiences in the comments below. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next one.